Hello again. Welcome back to our student organization finance orientation. In this module, we'll be talking a little bit about the budget request process, learning a little bit about how to request funding, and making sure that you have access to funds if you need funding for your event. So as I mentioned in the previous video, today we're going to be talking about the event planning process. So this kind of step Hello again. Welcome back to our student organization finance orientation. This module will talk about acquiring funds for your events or submitting a budget request. I'll talk a little bit about the allocations process as well as additional sources for funding that student organizations have access to. As I mentioned in the previous video, we want to talk about the event planning process. So this is what we have kind of determined to be the event planning process for our student organizations. And you'll notice that the budget request or the allocations process is at the beginning of this event planning process and steps. These steps are not like a step-by-step exclusively. There's a couple of things that kind of have to happen simultaneously or sometimes depend on what cycle it is that you're requesting funding for, as well as other additional criteria for your event. So, but we want to get started to talking about allocations and requesting funding for an event. So if you have determined that you need funds for your event, whether it is that you're planning to purchase supplies, food, you need a vendor, contract a vendor, or have a performer or things of that nature in your event, this is how you would go about acquiring funding. The first thing that you want to determine is whether or not you already have access to funds. You might have revenue funds in your account that you're not aware of, or access to startup funding or additional funding elsewhere. Some of the things that you need to think about is the different line items that you need for an event. So whether you need funding for supplies, food, marketing, if you're, again, contracting a vendor, things of that nature. And then also think about what are some things that you already have. So if your organization has a box of supplies from a previous event that you want to get some use out of, you're always welcome to utilize that as well. So make sure you're taking a look at those things so you're not purchasing more things for an organization, for an event that you already have things for. So like I mentioned, I wanted to talk a little bit about the funding sources that student organizations have. Each student organization has three kind of accounts. Two of these accounts come from the Student Activities Fund, which is a percentage of the student development fee that all undergraduate students have. All student organizations also have a revenue account. This is the student organization's money. These student organizations accounts have funds that can be acquired through fundraising, if you collect dues at the beginning of the year, and things of that nature. What's important to note about revenue is that these are funds that are owned by the student organization, that the student organization can utilize for most requests. So obviously with some limitations, but organizations can utilize this for merchandise and things of that nature. And these funds roll over. So that means that if your organization has access to these funds, we do encourage you to use them, but they also will be saved for the remainder for the following years. On the other hand, when you have Student Activities Fund, these funds can be acquired through either the allocation cycles, which are the SAF accounts distributed by the Allocations Committee. There are three different cycles. We have Spot, Rolling Fund, and SBR, and I'll talk about all three of these at some point. And then you also have your access to your startup funding, which is $250 at the beginning of the academic year. Our startup funds, those $250 last through the academic year, but then at the end of the academic year, all unspent funds get redistributed. For the SAF cycles, those operate on a semester basis. So if you have funds for the fall semester, you need to make sure you utilize those funds for the events that you requested, or else those funds are swept and redistributed the following semester. So you got to make sure you're spending the funds that you have access to. And if you're unable to spend those funds, that's also totally fine. We strongly encourage you to let us know that you're unable to utilize funds so that we can then redistribute to other organizations as well. So the first thing that I want to talk about is startup funding. Some treasurers have already gone through this process, but you can submit startup funding requests now. So if you're interested in requesting up to $250 for startup funding, you can go ahead and do so by submitting a budget request. The video on submitting a budget request should have been completed through your pre-orientation training. So if you need to take a look at that again, you can go back to your tracks and checklists, and make sure you review that prior to submitting a budget request. But you can use the 250 for either tabling events, marketing needs, any supplies that you might need for either general body meetings or any smaller events that you might want to host. And you can utilize these funds again throughout the academic year. We strongly encourage you to utilize the funds that you have access to, and just make use of the funds that you have. Like I mentioned before, the Student Activities Fund comes from a portion of the student development fee, and it is distributed by the Allocations Committee across 3 cycles. So any funds that are allocated by the approval of the Allocations Committee belong to the Loyola University of Chicago student body at large, not to individuals or student organizations. So what I want to highlight in this is that when you have funding that is distributed by allocations for student activities funded events, these events need to be for the student body. So these are not events that are just exclusive to your organization or events that do not serve the entire student body. So allocations committee, in reviewing events, they want to make sure that all of the events that are being requested are open and accessible to all students, because the funds are coming from all students, right? So we want to make sure that these funds are utilized for students and not just for a specific organization. It's also important to note that the use of these funds is a privilege. So this can be withdrawn or adjusted at any time based on the allocations committee, the allocations advisor, and administration of the Division of Student Development. So if an organization is not in good standing, student activities funds might be paused or removed. The Allocations Committee is the committee that is in charge of distributing these funds. They are made up of elected undergraduate senators from the student government. So if you are interested in serving in the Allocations Committee, you can join student government and have a say in what events get funded, and making sure that that funding gets distributed equitably across student organizations. We also have an allocations chair who is also elected into their position, as well as a staff advisor from CSE, which is me. The committee oversees the distribution of the student activities fee, and reviews all budget requests to determine funding based on guidelines, as well as the availability of funds. All funding decisions are at the discretion of the committee, and more often than not depend on the availability of funding. As I mentioned before, we have 3 allocation cycles that you can request funding through. The first one that I want to highlight is the spot cycle. A spot cycle occurs at the beginning of the academic semester. This is for events happening on the same semester. So if you're hoping to have an event sometime in the fall semester, you would request funding through here. Organizations can request up to 3 events per organization and up to $5,000 per event. This is for relatively smaller scale events, or just regular events for most student organizations, as well as event without contracts. So if you are hoping to have an event with a full contract process, you do need to request that through the semester budget request and do that a semester in advance. But if you're hoping to utilize one of our open contracts, which we'll be talking about momentarily in a few modules, you can request those through the spot cycle. We also have rolling funding. So rolling funds are weekly cycles that allow organizations to request supplemental funding in the case of an emergency or unanticipated event. Organizations can request up to $2,000 per request, but can only submit 1 request per week. This again is for anything that kind of pops up. It can be for example, if an event is already happening and the organization realizes that they actually need additional funding, you can request rolling funds or utilize rolling funds to do that. Also, if something happens in the world that pertains to your student organization and you want to have an event that's kind of last minute that you obviously did not plan for a semester before, you can utilize this request as well. What is important to note is that these funds are on a first come, first served basis. And we do prioritize organizations that have not received funding, just to make sure that they have additional opportunities to receive funding if they have yet to receive any. And then finally, we have our semester budget request, or SBR. Our SBR cycle occurs at the end of the academic semester, and this is for events happening the following semester. Organizations can request up to 3 events, but they can request up to $20,000 per organization, so there's no event limit. So theoretically, an organization could request an event that's about $1,500, $15,000. I strongly encourage that if you are going to do that, that you are properly planning your event. But these are for these events that are large-scale events that require contracts. Obviously, you can request smaller events through this as well. But this is kind of, we want to ensure that if you are hoping to host one of those larger scale events, that you are planning far in advance. The timelines for these cycles are included in our budget deadlines and resources site. If you scan this QR code, you'll be able to access those budget deadlines. Something that's important to note is that the spot cycle opens early in the semester and it closes early in the semester as well. So you want to make sure you get in and start submitting your requests as soon as possible. Those deadlines are highlighted there. So please make sure to take a look at that and make sure to take a look at the deadlines for the rest of the semester as well, so that you can plan in advance for the remainder of the semester. Finally, we have our allocations manual. If you want to review the allocations guidelines, including proper documentation, any prohibited items, budget and line item limits, please read the allocations manual. If you have any questions, you can email allocations and then find additional resources on LE Community and on our website. I strongly encourage you to take a look at the allocations manual. It includes a lot of information about types of documentation that you can submit. The budget request process was also included in the pre-orientation material, so please make sure to revise that prior to submitting a budget request through Spot. And like I said, once again, if you have any questions about budget requests and submitting a budget request, you can go ahead and reach out to allocations. Now, that is the first step of the event process. Of course, not every event requires funding. So if you don't need funding for your event and you already have access to funds, then you can always move on to the following steps, which include either a purchase request, but if you are not using any funding at all, you can go ahead and submit that activity request, space request from the beginning. We will once again talk about all of these things a little bit later, but please make sure to review the allocations manual to make sure you're submitting everything properly.